This story is titled, My Mill Tried to Steal My Inherited House with a Fake Lawyer. She didn't know I'm a real one until it was too late. Looking back, I should have known my mother-in-law wouldn't stay in her lane. I should have seen the signs, the way she always positioned herself at the center of every decision, as though nothing in our lives could ever happen without her approval. But back then, I was still naive enough to think she was just another overbearing in-law. Annoying, sure, but harmless. I was wrong. When my uncle passed away, leaving me his old beach house, I thought it was simply a bittersweet reminder of family and the passage of time. The house had been in our family for generations. A quiet little place by the shore with peeling white shutters and a wraparound porch that creaked underfoot. It wasn't luxurious by any means. The plumbing was a mess, the walls needed work, and the salty air had taken its toll on just about everything. But it had a soul, a history written into every floorboard and every faded photograph still hanging on the walls. The first time Stacy and I stepped inside after the will was settled, I felt something stir in my chest. It was a mix of nostalgia and responsibility, like I was standing at the crossroads of the past and the future, carrying a legacy that was now mine to protect. Stacy had been just as taken with it, running her fingers over the dusty furniture, laughing about how we could turn it into our little retreat from the world. But Patty saw something else entirely. At first, she pretended it was just an innocent curiosity. A few casual questions, a raised eyebrow here and there. Little remarks that seemed harmless if you didn't read between the lines. A beach house is a lot of responsibility, don't you think? Keeping up with maintenance must be expensive. Are you sure it wouldn't be smarter to sell? It was the way she said it, the almost gentle manipulation woven into her words, that made it so insidious. She wasn't outright criticizing us for wanting to keep it. She was planting seeds, nudging us toward doubt. I could feel the weight of it in every interaction, the underlying suggestion that we weren't quite capable enough to handle what had been passed down to me. And then the visits started. At first, it was just once or twice, her showing up at the house under the flimsy excuse that she had been in the area. But Patty lived 60 miles away, and the beach house was even farther. There was no reason for her to be dropping by so frequently, yet there she was, standing on the porch with that all-too-familiar tight-lipped smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She made it seem casual, just checking in, just looking around, just making sure everything was okay. But there was something in the way she lingered, in the way she walked through the house with too much familiarity, opening cabinets, running her fingers over countertops like she was the one making plans for renovations. I should have confronted her earlier, shut it down before it escalated, but at the time, I didn't want to create unnecessary tension. I figured if we ignored it, if we didn't feed into whatever odd fixation she had on the place, she'd lose interest and move on. That was wishful thinking. One afternoon, I got a call from Frank, the old retiree who had lived next door to my uncle for years. He was the kind of guy who noticed everything, the unofficial guardian of the neighborhood who always had an eye on what was going on. He kept his voice light, but there was something in his tone, a certain unease beneath his words. He told me he had seen a woman poking around the property, peeking through windows, standing on the porch like she was waiting for someone to let her in. And then he hesitated, almost as if he wasn't sure whether to say it outright, before mentioning the hair, big, voluminous, impossible to miss. That was all I needed to hear. Patty. I confronted her the next time she showed up, fully expecting some kind of excuse, and she didn't disappoint. With that same practiced air of innocence, she laughed off my concern, waving a hand like it was all some misunderstanding. I was just making sure everything was okay, dear. A house like this can be so much work. I wanted to see if there was anything you needed help with. She said it so smoothly, so effortlessly, as if breaking into my property was the most natural thing in the world. And yet the worst part wasn't even that she had done it. It was the absolute lack of remorse in her voice, the way she treated my frustration as an overreaction, like I was being ridiculous for not seeing her so-called concern as anything other than an act of kindness. But that wasn't even the worst of it, because over the next few weeks, little unexplainable things started happening. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A chair moved slightly out of place, a window unlocked that I could have sworn I latched the last time we were there. Small, almost insignificant details that could have been dismissed as forgetfulness, except they started piling up. A week later, I came back from running errands and found a folder sitting on the kitchen table. It was just lying there plain as day, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. I picked it up, flipping through the contents, and my stomach dropped. Property documents? At first, I thought maybe they were just old records, something my uncle had left behind. But then, as I read further, I noticed something off. Notes scribbled in the margins, written in Patty's unmistakable handwriting. Phrases jumped out at me. Family legacy. secure ownership. And suddenly everything clicked into place. Patty wasn't just being nosy, she was planning something. And whatever it wasn't going to end well. For a few days, I tried to convince myself that I was reading too much into things, that maybe I was letting my frustration with Patty color my perception of events that could have been nothing more than simple mistakes or forgotten details. Maybe I had left that window unlocked. Maybe I had shifted that chair absent-mindedly while passing through the room. Maybe the creeping feeling that something was off was just my own paranoia whispering in my ear, telling me to see ghosts where there were none. But the moment I saw those papers, carefully arranged on the kitchen table as if someone had been sitting there reviewing them, making notes, sketching out some plan that I wasn't meant to see, I knew beyond any doubt that this wasn't just in my head. Patty wasn't merely overstepping boundaries out of curiosity or concern. This was something deliberate, something calculated, something I had been too blind to see taking shape right in front of me. The notes she had scribbled in the margins of those documents weren't idle thoughts. They were the careful considerations of a person who was plotting something, laying the groundwork for a move she had been planning for longer than I had realized. The worst part, the part that made my blood run cold even as anger simmered just beneath the surface, was how brazen she had been about it, how she had left the evidence right in the open, as if she was so certain of her control over the situation that she didn't even feel the need to hide it. That realization alone sent a sickening wave of unease through me, because it meant she wasn't just testing the waters anymore. She had already made up her mind, already set her sights on something that belonged to me. I took a breath, forcing myself to stay calm, to push down the immediate impulse to storm over to her house and demand an explanation, because that's exactly what she would have expected me to do. Confronting her now, when I had nothing more than suspicions and scattered pieces of evidence, would do nothing but give her the upper hand. She would play the victim, twisting the narrative just enough to make it seem like I was being irrational, that I was lashing out over nothing. And somehow, by the end of it, she would be the one receiving sympathy, while I was painted as the unreasonable one. So instead, I did what I had learned to do in law school, what had served me well in the courtroom time and time again. I waited. I observed. I gathered evidence. And sure enough, it didn't take long before Patty made her next move. It started subtly, little things that, on their own, might not have been enough to raise suspicion, but, when strung together, painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. A locksmith's card left on the kitchen counter, its bright red lettering standing out against the faded wood as if daring me to question how it got there. A stack of mail sitting on the entryway table, half addressed to me, half to a name I didn't recognize, a name that had never been associated with this property before. A realtor's brochure tucked beneath a pile of papers, as if someone had been casually flipping through listings, considering options, weighing possibilities. And then, just when I thought I had seen enough, when I had convinced myself that I had gathered enough proof to confirm my worst fears, I saw her. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of crisp, clear day where the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and sun-warmed sand, a day where the waves crashed against the shore with a rhythmic certainty that should have been calming, should have made me feel at peace. But instead, standing at the edge of the property, watching from the shadows of the tree line, I felt nothing but a quiet, simmering rage settle in my chest. Because there she was, standing on the porch as if she belonged there, as if the house already belonged to her. Patty wasn't alone. She was with a man I didn't recognize, someone in a suit, someone who carried himself with the self-assured ease of a person who dealt in property and contracts and numbers, the kind of person who wouldn't be there unless they believed there was a deal to be made. She gestured toward the house, speaking animatedly, her hands moving in wide, exaggerated motions as if she was describing all the potential the place held, all the changes she envisioned, all the ways it could be transformed into something more befitting of her tastes. I didn't move. I didn't step forward or make my presence known. Didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing my reaction, of knowing that she had once again crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Instead, I stayed where I was, watching, listening, waiting, because I needed to know exactly how deep this went, needed to understand just how far she was planning to take this. And then I heard it. Not from Patty, but from the man beside her, the one who had been nodding along to her every word, as if this was nothing more than a routine business discussion. So when is the official transfer happening? Official transfer? The words rang in my ears like the distant toll of a warning bell, low and ominous, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine even as my hands curled into fists at my sides. Patty didn't hesitate. Didn't even pause to consider her answer, because she had already decided, had already convinced herself that this was happening, that this house was hers to do with as she pleased. I forced myself to breathe, to stay still, to push back the immediate surge of adrenaline that threatened to take over, because this wasn't the time to act on impulse. No, if she wanted to play this game, if she wanted to step onto this battlefield thinking she had already won, then I was going to make damn sure she realized just how wrong she was. This wasn't just an overbearing mother-in-law overstepping her bounds anymore. This wasn't just a nuisance or an inconvenience. This was fraud. And the only thing more satisfying than stopping her in her tracks would be watching the moment she realized she had picked a fight with the wrong damn person. There is a particular kind of anger that doesn't come in sharp bursts or violent outbursts, but instead settles deep into the bones, spreading through every inch of the body like a slow, creeping fire that refuses to be extinguished. It is a patient, calculated sort of rage, one that does not burn out quickly but lingers, waiting for the exact right moment to unleash itself. That was the kind of anger I felt as I stood there, hidden in the shadows just beyond the property line, listening to my mother-in-law speak with a man who, based on the few words exchanged, was someone she had no business speaking to. It wasn't just the audacity of what she was trying to do that made my pulse hammer in my ears, or the fact that she had been brazen enough to bring someone here in broad daylight, walking around as though she had already taken ownership of something that was never hers to begin with. It was the absolute certainty in her voice, the casual way she described her plans for the house, as if I had never existed in the equation at all, as if my name on the deed was just some minor inconvenience that she had already taken steps to erase. I forced myself to stay calm, to think logically, to remind myself that reacting emotionally would only give her the advantage she wanted. Patty thrived on drama, on playing the victim, on twisting reality into whatever version best suited her needs. If I confronted her now with nothing but my own outrage and accusations, she would turn the entire situation inside out, making herself appear as the concerned, well-meaning mother-in-law who had simply been trying to protect her daughter's best interests while painting me as the ungrateful, territorial son-in-law who refused to listen to reason. And that was not a game I intended to play. So, instead, I did what I did best. I observed. I listened. I made sure to commit every single word to memory, taking note of the way she spoke, the details she shared, the smooth, confident tone she used when the man beside her asked if everything was in order for the legal transition of ownership. The way she replied without hesitation, telling him that the necessary paperwork had been taken care of, sent an icy chill crawling up my spine. Because I knew, without a doubt, that I had never signed a single document that would transfer ownership of this house to anyone, least of all her. And that meant one thing. She had forged something. The realization hit me with a force so sudden and absolute that for a brief moment, all I could do was stand there, staring at the scene unfolding before me, wondering just how far she had gone in her delusion. I had known for weeks that something was off, had sensed it in the way she lingered around the house, in the documents I had found scattered on the kitchen table, in the little breadcrumbs of deception she had been leaving in her wake, thinking no one would notice. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't just manipulation or boundary stomping or the kind of passive-aggressive interference that I had learned to tolerate over the years. This was criminal. This was fraud. This was an attempt to steal what was mine, using whatever forged paperwork she had managed to get her hands on to make it look legitimate. And that was the moment when something inside me shifted. Up until that point, I had been trying to play fair. I had been holding back, thinking that maybe, just maybe, she would realize that this was a fight she couldn't win, that she would step back before she went too far. But Patty didn't know when to quit. She never had. She believed, deep down, that she could bend the world to her will, that if she pushed hard enough, manipulated cleverly enough, she could make anything hers. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She had forgotten that I was a lawyer. For years, I had built my career around understanding the fine print, around recognizing the smallest details that could turn an entire case upside down. I'd seen every kind of legal deception imaginable. Contract disputes, fraudulent claims, shady business dealings that fell apart under the weight of their own arrogance. And now my mother-in-law had placed herself directly in my territory, playing a game she didn't even realize she had already lost. I spent the next 2 days digging deep, using every legal resource at my disposal to find out exactly what she had done. And when I finally uncovered it, when I found the fraudulent transfer document that had been submitted to the county records office under my name, I felt something close to satisfaction settle in my chest. Because now I had proof, not just of her deception, but of the lengths she had gone to in order to get what she wanted. The document itself was laughable, a sloppy forgery riddled with inconsistencies that no trained eye would ever overlook. The signature was a poor imitation of my own, the notary stamp clearly falsified, The wording clumsy and amateurish, as if she had paid someone under the table to throw it together in a hurry, never stopping to consider that she was trying to pull one over on someone who specialized in catching people exactly like her. The best part, she had used a fake lawyer to submit it. The name on the legal paperwork didn't belong to any real attorney, at least not one licensed to practice in this state. A quick search through official legal directories confirmed what I had already suspected. The person who had helped Patty commit fraud didn't even exist on paper. And that was the moment I knew. She had walked herself into a legal disaster, and the only thing left to do was sit back and watch her unravel when she realized it. I could have gone straight to the authorities right then and there, could have filed a formal fraud complaint, turned over the evidence, and let the legal system tear her scheme apart piece by piece. But I wanted to see it unfold. I wanted her to think she had succeeded, just long enough for her to get comfortable, to let her guard down, to feel secure in her victory, only for it to come crashing down around her the moment she realized the trap she had walked into. And so I waited. I let her continue, let her think that she was moving her plan along without resistance, let her schedule meetings, let her bring in more people, let her dig herself deeper into her own deception. Because the more she did, the worse it would be for her in the end. And when the time was right, when I had every single piece of evidence I needed lined up neatly in front of me, I was going to let her know exactly what it felt like to lose. Because this house was never going to be hers. Update. There's a certain kind of satisfaction that comes from watching a plan unfold exactly as you predicted. A slow and inevitable unraveling of someone who thought they had control but never realized they were walking straight into a carefully laid trap. It's the kind of satisfaction that builds not from pettiness or vindictiveness, but from the quiet certainty that justice is about to be served, that the weight of someone's own arrogance will come crashing down on them before they even understand what's happening. And as I sat back, watching Patty push forward with her stolen victory, I knew that moment was approaching faster than she could have ever anticipated. I had everything I needed: the fraudulent documents, the fake notary signatures, the non-existent lawyer whose name had been stamped onto legal paperwork as if that alone made it real. I had the paper trail that led directly to her, each step documented with painful clarity, each attempt at deception leaving behind breadcrumbs that no real professional would have been foolish enough to overlook. All that remained was the final act, the moment when she would be forced to come face to face with the consequences of what she had done. So I waited. I let her continue playing her game, let her move with the confidence of someone who had convinced herself she had already won, let her schedule meetings, make calls, and push her scheme further, deeper, past the point of no return. I made no move to stop her, made no attempt to interfere, because the deeper she dug herself in, the worse it would be when the walls finally closed in around her. And then, just as I had anticipated, she made the mistake that would seal her fate completely. A letter arrived at the house, printed on cheap, flimsy stationery, the kind that was clearly meant to look official but fell apart under even the slightest scrutiny. The return address was unfamiliar, a law office that didn't exist in any database I checked, yet the contents were exactly what I had expected. A formal notice informing me that the property had been transferred and that I had 30 days to vacate the premises before legal action would be taken against me. The audacity was almost impressive. For a brief moment, I imagined what Patty must have been thinking as she orchestrated this final move. How she must have convinced herself that this was the moment she had been working toward, the final push that would force me to step aside and leave her to claim what she had decided was rightfully hers. She had likely spent weeks preparing for this, aligning everything in her mind, telling herself that she had been clever enough, thorough enough, that there was no possible way I could challenge her without looking like the unreasonable one. And I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because what she didn't know, what she could have never anticipated, was that I had already taken every piece of evidence I had collected and handed it over to a real attorney, one who specialized in fraud, forgery, and real estate disputes. I had already sat through meetings, gone over every single discrepancy in the paperwork, traced every falsified document back to the very people who had helped her forge them. And as soon as that letter had arrived, as soon as she had taken the final step in making her fraudulent claim official, the case was closed. Patty was about to learn that stealing a house wasn't as easy as scribbling a few fake signatures onto a document and hoping no one would look too closely. I wasted no time in responding. Instead of allowing her the satisfaction of a direct confrontation, of giving her the chance to spin her version of the story and position herself as the misunderstood victim, I took the only approach that would guarantee she had nowhere to turn. I sent my response through my lawyer, a meticulously crafted legal notice that not only challenged the fraudulent transfer, but laid out, in excruciating detail, every single law she had violated in the process. The wording was cold, clinical, an unflinching breakdown of every illegal action she had taken, with references to case law, penal codes, and exactly what the legal consequences would be if she did not immediately retract her claim and cease all further attempts to seize the property. And then, for the first time since this had all begun, I waited for her to react. It didn't take long. The first sign that she had received the notice came in the form of an abrupt silence, a complete and total lack of the usual texts, calls, or passive-aggressive comments that had been a constant presence for as long as I had known her. She didn't immediately retaliate, which told me one thing: she was panicking. I pictured her sitting in her house, reading the letter over and over again, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what had gone wrong, how her perfectly laid plan had suddenly been flipped on its head. She had likely expected resistance, of course, had likely anticipated that I would fight back, but she hadn't expected this level of precision, this absolute dismantling of every move she had made, laid out before her in a way that left no room for escape. And then finally, the inevitable happened. She showed up at my doorstep. I had seen it coming the moment I heard the tires in the driveway, the heavy slam of a car door, the hurried, uneven footsteps of someone who was desperately trying to compose themselves but failing miserably. By the time I opened the door, she was already standing there, shifting her weight, her expression carefully measured, hovering somewhere between forced innocence and barely concealed rage. She didn't even try to play it cool. She launched into her defense immediately, her voice high and breathless, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic attempt to make sense of what was happening. She insisted that this was all a misunderstanding, that she had never intended to take the house from me, that she had simply been trying to secure a future for Stacy, for the family, for the people who mattered most. I let her talk. I let her spill every excuse, every carefully crafted half-truth, let her dig herself even deeper with every desperate word that left her mouth. And then, when she had finally exhausted herself, when she had run out of ways to explain away the very real evidence that was now stacked against her, I handed her the final blow, a secondary notice informing her that the fraud complaint had already been filed with the authorities, that her attempt to transfer the property under falsified documentation had been flagged as a criminal offense, and that if she did not immediately retract her claim, she would be facing an investigation that could very well lead to charges. For the first time since I had known her, Patty had nothing to say. She stood there in stunned silence, her mouth opening and closing slightly as if searching for some last-ditch argument, some loophole she could wriggle through, but there was nothing left. She had lost. She just hadn't realized how badly she had lost until this exact moment. And as I watched her turn away, shoulders hunched, her entire presence deflated by the weight of her own failure, I felt nothing but relief. Because the war she thought she had won had never even been a battle. She had walked herself straight into a legal nightmare, and now there was nothing left for her to do but face the consequences of her own arrogance. And for the first time since this had all begun, I knew with absolute certainty that she would never try something like this again. There is something undeniably satisfying about watching a person who has spent so much time believing they are untouchable finally come to terms with the fact that they are, in fact, not immune to the consequences of their own actions. It is not the satisfaction of cruelty, nor is it the kind of gloating victory that comes from wanting to see someone suffer, but rather, it is the simple, undeniable truth that justice has finally caught up to them, that the weight of their own choices is now pressing down on them with the force of something that can no longer be ignored. And as I stood there, watching Patty's entire world crumble under the realization that she had played a game far beyond her skill set, I felt nothing but a sense of cold, unwavering certainty that this was exactly what she deserved. The silence that followed my final words was deafening, stretching between us like the unspoken understanding that there was no more room for debate, no more manipulations left for her to attempt, no more excuses she could spin into some version of the truth that would paint her as anything other than what she was, a woman who had committed fraud and been caught red-handed. And as the moments dragged on, as she stood there, shifting on her feet, eyes darting wildly as if searching for some invisible escape route, I could see it settling in, the slow and inevitable collapse of her carefully constructed delusion. For years, she had built her life around the belief that she could bend people to her will, that if she pushed hard enough, if she applied the right amount of guilt, pressure, and carefully disguised manipulation, she could make anyone dance to the tune she played. She had convinced herself that she was untouchable, that no matter what she did, there would always be a way out, always a way to twist the situation until she emerged unscathed, if not outright victorious. But this time, she had gone too far, and now there was nowhere left for her to turn. I watched as she took a slow, shaky breath, her hands curling into tight fists at her sides, her face shifting through a rapid series of emotions, each one flickering across her features like a storm trying to decide which direction to break. First, there was shock, the wide-eyed disbelief that she was actually in this position, that the reality she had spent so much time constructing was now crumbling beneath her feet. Then came anger, sharp and bitter, the kind of anger that comes from knowing that no matter how much you fight, there is nothing left to be done. And finally, fear. The fear was what struck me the most. Patty was not a woman accustomed to being afraid. She had built her entire existence around control, around ensuring that she was the one pulling the strings, the one dictating the terms of every interaction, every relationship, every situation she inserted herself into. She had never had to truly reckon with the idea that there could be a world in which she wasn't in charge, in which the choices she made didn't automatically work in her favor. And now, standing here, with the full weight of the legal consequences looming over her, she was finally beginning to grasp what that meant. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin, wavering, lacking the ironclad authority she so often wielded like a weapon. She asked if there was any way to undo what had been done, if there was some kind of arrangement we could come to, some way to put this all behind us without having to involve the legal system further. It was a last-ditch effort, a desperate attempt to salvage something, to regain some small sliver of control over a situation that had completely slipped through her fingers. But there was no arrangement to be made. I told her that this was no longer in my hands, that the fraud complaint had already been filed, that the wheels had already been set in motion. It wasn't a matter of personal forgiveness or family disputes anymore. This was the law, and the law didn't care about her excuses. She had committed a crime. She had forged legal documents. She had attempted to steal property that did not belong to her. And now she would have to deal with the very real consequences of those actions. For the first time since I had known her, Patty had no response. She stood there for a moment longer, as if hoping that by sheer force of will she could reverse time, undo everything, make all of this disappear with a single, well-placed word. But there was nothing left to say. No way out. No one left to manipulate. No reality left where she came out of this unscathed. And then without another word, she turned and walked away. I watched as she moved toward her car, shoulders hunched, her entire presence deflated by the weight of her own downfall. There was no final outburst, no attempt to lash out in anger or make some last, desperate play for control. She simply got into her car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving behind nothing but the aftermath of her own destruction. And just like that, it was over. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and merciless. The forged documents were flagged immediately, and with the overwhelming evidence stacked against her, there was no way for her to talk her way out of it. The fraudulent property transfer was formally revoked, and Patty was hit with a barrage of legal repercussions, fines, court hearings, a permanent black mark on her record that would follow her for years to come. In the end, she lost everything she had tried to steal, and as I stood on the porch of my house, the house that was and always had been rightfully mine, I took a deep breath, letting the ocean air fill my lungs, feeling, for the first time in months, a sense of absolute, unshakable peace. Because Patty had tried to take everything from me, and in the end, she had only succeeded in destroying herself. Update. There is a strange stillness that comes after the storm, a quiet that settles in the spaces where chaos once thrived, stretching across the days like the slow unraveling of tension that had been wound too tight for too long. It was in that stillness, in the aftermath of Patty's destruction, that I found myself finally breathing freely, no longer tethered to the suffocating weight of her manipulations, no longer looking over my shoulder or waiting for the next intrusive move, the next underhanded scheme, the next carefully orchestrated deception meant to rip away something that had never belonged to her in the first place. But even in that newfound quiet, the ripples of her actions did not disappear overnight. The legal battle had been swift, not because she had willingly accepted the consequences, but because there had been no way for her to fight back, no loopholes to slip through, no technicalities to exploit, no last-minute tricks to twist the situation in her favor. The forged documents had been enough to bury her in legal trouble she had never anticipated, and when the judge handed down the decision, officially nullifying her fraudulent attempt to seize the house, there had been no gasps of shock, no last-ditch pleas for leniency, just the slow, crushing realization that she had lost everything she had tried to steal, that no amount of manipulation or carefully crafted narratives could undo the reality she had brought upon herself. Yet, even as the dust settled, even as the house remained securely in my name, untouched, unchallenged, rightfully mine as it had always been, there was another battle that followed. one I had not been entirely prepared for. The moment the truth came to light, when the full weight of Patty's deception was laid bare for everyone to see, it sent shockwaves through the family, splitting them into those who accepted the reality of what she had done, and those who, despite everything, refused to see her as anything other than a misunderstood woman who had simply made a mistake, a victim of her own misguided attempts to do what she thought was best. And at the center of that divide was Stacy. From the moment this nightmare had begun, she had chosen to believe the best in her mother, had convinced herself that Patty's meddling was just that, meddling, an overbearing attempt to be involved, a refusal to accept boundaries, but never something truly malicious, never something meant to cause harm. She had defended her, not because she agreed with what was happening, but because she had spent her entire life seeing her mother as someone who, despite her faults, had always been a force that could not be questioned. Someone whose actions could always be explained away as excessive, but never truly wrong. So when the truth was finally undeniable, when there was no version of events left where Patty could be seen as anything other than what she was, a woman who had attempted to commit fraud against her own family, it broke something in Stacy, something that had been carefully held together by years of forced rationalizations, by the unwillingness to confront the reality of who her mother truly was. I had hoped naively that once it was over, once the legal decision had been made and the house was permanently secured in my name, we could move forward, put the pieces of our life back together, return to something close to normal. But some things do not mend so easily, and the fracture that had formed between us in those weeks of battling her mother's lies did not disappear the moment the case was closed. She withdrew, not all at once, not in a way that was immediately obvious, but in small, almost imperceptible ways, like the slow pulling of a tide before a storm. Conversations that had once been easy became strained, filled with pauses that had never existed before, as though she was constantly searching for words that no longer came as naturally as they once had. She looked at me differently, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a quiet kind of sadness, a lingering weight in her eyes that I could not fix no matter how many times I told her that she had done nothing wrong, that she was not responsible for the choices her mother had made. But I could see it in her, the guilt, the shame of knowing that the woman who had raised her, the woman she had trusted, had done something so unforgivable and worse, that she had spent so much time trying to believe it wasn't what it so clearly was. She had defended the indefensible, not out of malice, not because she had agreed, but because she had been unable to accept the truth that had been staring her in the face all along. And so in the weeks that followed, as the weight of it all settled over us, the distance grew. It was not a fight that ended us. It was not anger or blame or resentment. It was simply the quiet realization that something between us had been irreversibly changed, that no matter how much we wanted to pretend we could return to what had been, the foundation had cracked and neither of us knew how to rebuild it. In the end, it was Stacy who made the decision to leave. She did not do it in anger, did not storm out or make dramatic declarations, did not hurl accusations or demand explanations that neither of us could give. She simply told me one evening as we sat in the house that had once been ours, that she needed time, needed space, needed to figure out who she was outside of the weight of her mother's choices, outside of the guilt she carried, outside of the shadows this battle had cast over her life. I did not argue, because I understood. I understood that she needed to heal, that there were wounds she had not yet figured out how to name, that she was searching for something she could not find within the walls of the home that had become a battleground. And so she left. She packed a bag, said goodbye, and walked out of the house that had once been filled with our plans, our dreams, our future, leaving behind nothing but the ghost of what could have been, of what had been lost in the aftermath of a war neither of us had asked for. In the months that followed, I learned to live in the quiet again. The house, once filled with tension, once echoing with the weight of battles fought and won, became mine in a way it had never been before, not just in name, not just in legal ownership, but in the way it felt to exist within its walls, free of the presence of those who had once tried to claim it as their own. And Patty? Patty faded. Her influence, once so suffocating, once so omnipresent, became nothing more than a cautionary tale, a story of a woman who had overplayed her hand, who had built her empire on manipulation and control, only to watch it collapse around her in the moment she finally met someone who refused to bow beneath it. She lost her social standing. People who had once humored her, once entertained her endless games, now saw her for what she truly was, not because they suddenly cared about morality, but because there is nothing more damning than public failure, nothing that people turn away from faster than a woman who had once wielded power, but had now been exposed as nothing more than a fraud. And I moved on. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, in the way people do when they have finally stepped out from beneath the shadow of something they never should have had to fight in the first place. The house remained mine. My peace remained intact. And Patty? Patty would never set foot near either again.